Good morning, everyone. I think we'll get started. Welcome. My name is Hannah Storm. I'm the director of the International News Safety Institute, and I'm very pleased to be here to moderate this panel with some amazing and very distinguished colleagues. So I'll introduce them first, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about how we came to do the report. I have tweeted a copy of the report if people are interested. I've got a hard copy here. It's the only version I've got, I'm afraid, but I can certainly signpost you towards getting a copy of it. You will be able to find it on the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism website as well. So I will just start from my left, your right, Professor Anthony Feinstein here, who is a professor of psychology. He has done groundbreaking research over the past couple of decades into the relationship between journalists and their mental health. So the work that journalists do in conflict, in post-conflict, local journalists, and the way they respond emotionally and psychologically to their work. To my right is Helen Long. She manages the Reuters video newsroom in London, and she's introduced a global peer network to Reuters, so she'll be talking about some of the work that she's done there. She's a distinguished foreign correspondent from having many years' experience working overseas as well. And then to her right is Will Vassilopoulos. Will is a Greek freelance journalist working mainly for Agence France Presse, and he spent significant amounts of time covering the refugee crisis. I think 20 times or so to Lesbos, and significantly during that period to which the refugee report that we're going to talk about today, 2015, so the peak of the refugee crisis. So how did we come to this report? In 2016, the organisation I work for, the International News Safety Institute, which is basically a network of some of the major news organisations around the world, we were approached by one of our members, and they said, look, you know, we normally talk about physical safety in war zones, but we're identifying something peculiar here. Our journalists who are covering the refugee crisis on European soil, which is one of the biggest stories that most news organisations had to cover in our generation from a non-conflict perspective. They're coming back, and we don't think there's something about the way they're dealing with the story that we're concerned about. We know that not a physical harm or physical risk, but we wonder what the emotional aspects of the work they're doing are. We're seeing this fallout of this conflict on European soil close to home. We're seeing journalists going home after covering stories. We're seeing journalists going to the beaches where they might take their kids on holiday and covering these stories. And there's something that doesn't quite, ring comfortably in our ears. So we brought together a group of journalists from the news and member organisations of INSI, and we started talking about this. And what came up from that was that it was really a valuable moment where we could try and explore how journalists were responding to the crisis, but also how we might better support them as journalist media organisations to build resilience, to understand their emotional responses to the situation, and to hopefully increase education. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to Anthony now, who co-authored the report with me into this, and he's going to talk us through some of the backgrounds, some of the work he's done previously that informs some of this study and some of the findings, and then we'll move on to hear from Will about some of his personal experiences, and Helen as well. We do want to make this as interactive as possible, so do feel free to ask us questions. I'm acutely aware that in some situations people might not feel comfortable about talking in an open space like this. If you do want to talk to us about things, we can make ourselves accessible either by email or other manners afterwards as well. So thank you for your time and your patience. Anthony, can you talk us through the report?
Good. So thanks, Hannah. So I'm a behavioral scientist, and I try and measure behavior using numbers. And I'd just like to mention some of the studies that I did as a prelude to the refugee work. So. Going back about 18 years, we did the first study looking at how war journalists cope with the pressures of war. And we showed that rates of disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder could be quite high in this group. We then did a study after 9/11 showing that journalists working in New York were not immune to the effects of trauma when the World Trade Center came down. We subsequently went on to do a study in Iraq looking at the embedded journalists covering the war in Iraq. Did a study in Israel looking at the chronic stress that Israeli journalists are under. Did a study in Mexico looking at journalists covering the drug wars. Did a study in Syria looking at journalists covering the civil war right now. We did a study in Kenya looking at journalists covering the election violence going back 7 or 8 years. We've also done a study in Newsroom looking at how journalists process all these violent images that come in as part of user-generated content. And I mentioned all these studies. The final study is a study of Iran, looking at how Iranian journalists are intimidated by the country and the considerable psychological difficulties that they experience. And I put all these studies up as a prelude to what I'm going to speak about now, because it was a consistent finding across all these studies, which is that journalists, of course, are not immune to psychological risk. They can develop conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder and depression and anxiety disorders. They can misuse substances as a way of self-treating these conditions. And so we know now there's a substantial body of work showing that journalists can develop these problems. With the refugee crisis, you have a very different story, but one, of course, that is potentially very stressful as well. The UNHCR made this known that there are over 21 million refugees worldwide, the majority coming from Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia. There are 34,000 people who are being displaced daily, and the mortality and the morbidity linked to this enormous movement of people across the world is extremely high. So it's clearly not easy being a refugee. And the question that we try to answer in our study is, well, if you're a journalist, what's it like when you're covering this huge story? How does this affect you? The methodology used over here is something that I've used over the past 20 years. We establish a website to reach journalists. The data are encrypted, so they are as safe as we can make them. There's no personal identifying data. We capture things like demographics. Important to look at post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and then something I'm going to speak about, which emerged in the study, which is moral injury, which I'll define in a moment. We looked at, how journalists, what's their alcohol consumption, and then the stress of their work environment. And really, this is the gist of our findings, something called moral injury, which I just want to spend a minute going through. We define this as an injury done to a person's conscience or moral compass when that person perpetrates, witnesses, or fails to prevent acts that transgress their own moral or ethical values or codes of conduct. So just spend a moment looking at that definition, because this can arise as a result of something that you do, but it also might arise as something that you fail to do. So you look at someone else's action, which you see as morally wrong, but you don't do anything to correct it. And that can become the stress of moral injury as well. And while there's a fairly big literature now looking at things like post-traumatic stress disorder, etc., in journalists, no one has really looked at moral injury. Our study, we looked at 114 journalists who came from 8 different news organizations. You can see that the response rate was 70%. The majority were male, the majority were married. This is a highly educated group. Good education is protective in terms of one's mental health. A high percentage had previously covered war. The majority were covering refugees very close to their home. They were a group on average of 43 years of age. They'd been working as journalists for at least 18 years on average, so very experienced. And they'd been covering this refugee crisis for going on 20 months. So their exposure to the refugees was really intense and prolonged. We wanted to look at moral injury, as I say, because this was the focus of our work. And no one has really looked at moral injury in journalists, but the military are very familiar with this. And there is a moral injury scale that was developed by the military after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And these are the questions that you ask with respect to moral injury. I saw things that were morally wrong. I am troubled by witnessing others' immoral acts. I acted in ways that violated my own moral code or values. I'm troubled by having acted in this way. Most importantly here, I violated my own morals by failing to do something that I felt I should have done. And then I'm troubled because I violated my morals by failing to do something that I should have done. So you've got these 6 questions which journalists can rate, 6 possible responses. I strongly agree, moderately agree, slightly agree, etc., etc. And we record those responses. We also wanted to look at work-related questions to see whether this might affect how a journalist was functioning emotionally. And these were the questions that we asked. Do you feel the economic pressures of the industry affecting your work? Do you have the time and resources to do your work properly? Is your workload greater than a year back? Are you under pressure to compromise your personal ethics in pursuit of your deadline? Do the editors handling your story or photographs acknowledge the traumatic nature of the assignment? And how much control do you have over your own resources? And these were our data. So I'm pleased to report that the rates of post-traumatic stress disorder are very low in journalists covering the refugee crisis. Now you see three groupings of symptoms: intrusion, avoidance, and arousal. These are the core features of post-traumatic stress disorder. Intrusion refers to the person's unwanted recollections or memories of a traumatic event. The avoidance refers to the person's desire to stay away from recollections of that. So if you've been traumatized, there's a natural reaction: I want to stay away from something that's so unpleasant. And the arousal refers to your body's autonomic nervous system that becomes aroused. You cannot fall asleep, you become irritable, you become hypervigilant, you hear a loud noise and you have a startle response. And you can see from the data that we collected that there wasn't a high rate of this in the journalists covering the refugee crisis. We found very low rates of depression as well, which is obviously good news, and the alcohol consumption wasn't particularly high. And to put it in perspective, a man should not drink more than 14 drinks a week, according to the Canadian Medical Association, and a woman shouldn't drink more than 9 drinks per week. Those are the thresholds that are considered acceptable, and this group drank well below that. So just to show you what the data looked like graphically, you can see the normal distribution of data, which we see time and time again, and the area of worry, of concern over here is down here, right at the tip of the normal curve. There's going to be that small percentage of journalists who are not doing well with respect to PTSD and depression, but the numbers were low, to repeat. That's very important. We didn't see a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder. But now we come on to moral injury. And what did we see over here? So we showed that journalists with children were far more likely to endorse moral injury. Those with a higher workload in the past year, if they were working alone rather than with colleagues. Journalists who had not covered war previously were more likely to endorse violating their own moral code by failing to do something they felt they should have done. And most importantly, the journalists who said they were not receiving sufficient support from the news organizations were also more likely to endorse a sense of moral injury. And this is just to show you what they said. So the journalists covering this crisis, remember this is over 100 journalists, said, I saw things that were morally wrong. Absolutely, they strongly endorsed that. I'm troubled by having witnessed others' immoral acts. They agreed. I acted in ways that violated my own moral code of values. They agreed up to a point. I'm troubled by having done this. That was a problem as well. I violated my own morals by failing to do something that I felt I should have done. Not as common. And I'm troubled by that. Once again, not as common. What about the work-related questions? So, these are journalists under a lot of pressure doing this. Almost 60% said that the economic pressures of the industry were affecting their work. Did they have the time and resources to do their work properly? More than 50% said they did not. Is your workload greater than a year back? Almost 60% said yes. Thankfully, are you under pressure to compromise your own personal ethics in pursuit of meeting the deadline? Well, it depends on how you interpret this. Only 20% said yes, but you might argue that 20% is in fact quite high. Do editors handling your story acknowledge the potentially traumatic nature of your assignment? Well, I think editors are starting to do this. About 50% of the editors do acknowledge the traumatic nature of this. And then we asked the journalists, how much control do you have over your own work? And you can see there, 25% said very little, and only 44% had some control. So there's a sense of losing control of their own work. What are the factors linked to moral injury? Well, if you lose control over your own work, you're more likely to endorse this. What's not linked to moral injury? And this is very important. Gender. Gender is not linked to moral injury. Gender is, in fact, linked to post-traumatic stress disorder. Women are more likely to develop PTSD, but not more likely to develop moral injury. Education is not linked to moral injury. Education is linked to post-traumatic stress, by the way. People who are not well educated are more vulnerable to PTSD. So age, marital status, alcohol consumption, none of this was linked to moral injury. What about guilt? Because guilt is so integral to moral injury. So journalists certainly endorsed a moderate amount of guilt in their work. Some PTSD symptoms are linked to guilt as well. But journalists who were covering the refugee crisis close to home were far more likely to feel guilty about their work and what they saw. And journalists who had assisted the refugees, those who had stepped out of their role as a journalist to provide aid, were more likely to endorse feeling guilt. And the question is, did the guilt come from helping the refugees, or was it the other way around, that they feel morally obliged to help the refugees because of guilt, and we don't know. What about the relationship between moral injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, guilt, and depression? Well, we run these things through statistical programs, and we showed that journalists who had the unwanted, intrusive recollections of PTSD, in other words, the dreams, the flashbacks, etc., this was linked to moral injury. And this makes sense as well, that if you've got these repeated, unwanted recollections of something that's deeply unpleasant, that could be morally troubling to you. So what are the conclusions to take away from all these data? Well, the response rate to our study was excellent. Over 70% of the journalists responded. In the social sciences, that's a very good response rate. To repeat, we found very low rates of PTSD and depression, which is reassuring. But we did define moral injury as a problem in this group. And we showed that it's linked to demographic factors, particularly if you're more likely to have children. And moral injury is also linked to work circumstances, your sense of losing control over your story, and the fact that you might not be getting the necessary support from your news organization. So the final conclusions, what do we know about moral injury? And this is something that's pretty new to journalists, so we still have to explore it, but we can get some important messages from the military. That if an individual's got a sense of moral injury, you have much greater difficulty reintegrating back into society. It can also make you lose faith and enthusiasm in your chosen profession, so you can become cynical and disinterested in your role as a journalist. You are at long-term risk for conditions such as depression, and you certainly can have higher levels of psychological distress, which do not fit into any neat category. And the important point is this: moral injury is not a mental illness. Post-traumatic stress disorder is, depression is. Moral injury is not a mental illness. It's just your sense of moral outrage at having witnessed things that were deeply unpleasant to you. So I think there's a lot of work still to be done over here. This is the very first study of moral injury, but it does raise important questions, and I think it's well worth having a discussion about this. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. We will come to some of the progress and processes that have taken place since the report and some of the recommendations and considerations that have taken place in newsrooms, because I certainly think that that's a real area that we need to explore more of. But as Anthony has said, this is the first study. There's a lot more work that needs to be done, but it is the first study making that link between the media and moral injury, and for that reason, we believe it's very important, so we're grateful to talk here. I want to turn from the statistics and the data to the human story, to Will Vasilopoulos. And Will, when we heard about some of the demographics there, we've spoken a lot over the last 2 years that we've been friends and colleagues, and you tick a lot of those boxes, don't you? You're Greek, so you're working in your own home country. You're a dad. You fit within that age bracket. So there's a lot of, and you're working by yourself a lot of the time.
Yes.
So you want to share your story and then some of the way your journey has developed over the last couple of years.
Yes, I have. But if it's okay, if we could first show a video so we can put the audience to see it from my perspective. But what you're going to see now are images that I'm sure everyone is very familiar with. You've seen them 100 times. But I would like you to see it so much from my eyes, like from the eyes of a cameraman, of a video journalist, and not so much of the newsworthiness of the images, more of what it's like covering the sort of the refugee crisis for so many months. The migration crisis does not even come close to what refugees have gone through. At the end of the day, we're not the victims, the refugees are the victims. Having said that, covering the refugee crisis is extremely hard, and it's challenging for everyone in the field, the cameraman, the photographer, the producers, everyone, whoever is on the field. It is very difficult, and it's particularly difficult because it involves coverage of a humanitarian crisis, and you don't know what to expect and how it might hit you emotionally. You can prepare yourself mentally when you're going to a conflict zone, because you can put you're going to put your flak vest, you're ready from it emotionally from home before, but you cannot prepare for yourself when you go to your own country where it enjoys peace and see these sort of horrific images. It is very hard because Greece is not a country in war. And you should not be seeing these sort of images. It puts everything to the test, as a journalist. Not only your deontology, your ethics, everything. Because you keep on telling yourself that you're a professional and that you have to keep everything at a distance to tell the story in a balanced way. However, and that you should not become the story, However, there's a lot of gray when you're covering the refugee crisis, because many times it is difficult to keep a distance. It is very difficult if it comes to the point where you're the only person there that could give a helping hand and it's a matter of life or death. It really is difficult. So you have to many times decide when you're going to put your camera down, when you're going to put your photo camera down and give a helping hand. That's what I'm going to say for now.
Thank you, Will. I just want to, and I say Will and I have been friends now for 2 going on 3 years, and I sit in absolute awe for both the work he does, but also as Will mentioned, the way that journalists experience and respond to the migration crisis is, we know that the people whose stories we are covering, that there's an immense sense of privilege to be there and to tell their stories, but that any trauma that journalists experience isn't a patch on what the migrants and the refugees experience. So I will say that to corroborate what Will was saying. He's very quiet about the work he's done, and Will won the Rory Peck Award for News for some of the images there, which I'm sure you'll agree were absolutely stunning and staggering and particularly heartbreaking. And I just want to ask you a couple of questions, really, just before we move on to Helen, if that's okay. I know you struggled for a while with that sense of being recognised for your work, and that made you in some ways feel that perhaps it brought about awkward reactions in your mind. So I just want to ask you what your response to that was and how you dealt with that. And then also just one specific question around, you're coming back from the beaches to home, and the transition you have to make is a pretty quick one. How did you manage that transition?
Okay. Well, for the first one, winning the Rory Peck Award was truly an amazing experience. I did feel guilty, especially I remember at the ceremony. I was like, what am I going to say? I'm winning this award on the back of human suffering. It was difficult for me to balance that, and eventually I realized how important it is my work to be shown and that it's been recognized. So yes, it's easy. I did deal with that. As far as coming home from long assignments, that is one of the most difficult points in my life, because as soon as you open the door, you unlock your door, you have to become immediately a father, a husband. You don't have time to decompress. You've been seeing all these images like for days upon days, and it is very, very, very difficult. And one of the things that I did was I wanted to show my wife what it is that I go through, so she has a better understanding as well, and maybe she can help me decompress. So on one occasion, she took the kids and she visited me at Idomeni camp, just for half an hour. She came to the camp, but she saw with her own eyes what I see, 14 hours a day when I'm there, and that really helped.
Thank you, and I'm sure many of you have got questions for Will, which we will take, if that's okay, after Helen's spoken. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the processes that you found have been helpful for support, but I know you're going to talk about specifically the work you've been doing at Reuters as well.
Good morning, everyone. I am immensely proud of what we're doing at Reuters to support our colleagues in mental health and well-being. We are an industry leader in this, actually. We were among the first organizations more than 10 years ago to establish a 24/7 global hotline with a company called CIC, which is a counselling company that sources and finds a network of clinicians around the world. At that time, it was only open to our people working on the front line, in the frontline bureaus, people being parachuted into wars. Now, of course, you know, the news business is incredibly stressful. I think all of us working in this industry would agree. And with each year, it becomes ever more so, in part driven by technology, the internet, which has transformed what we do, and then, of course, the news cycle itself. I mean, the international system is, you know, it feels at times that it's breaking down, and that generates lots and lots of news. And for those of us working in this business, you know, it generates an awful lot of stress, having to produce more and more, often with, you know, less time, fewer resources. That's not peculiar to Reuters. You know, that is what the industry is going through and what it faces. So what we did a few years ago now, back in 2014, 2015, and this coincided with what we saw, and Anthony's done some work on this with UGC, which at that time was very much in its infancy. We set up a social media pilot desk. It was staffed by, you know, young freelancers fresh from college. You know, originally the idea was to, you know, find viral video. You know, what we had in mind was the skateboarding squirrels. But that, you know, that coincided with Islamic State's land grab across Syria and Iraq, and very quickly it was switched. Those guys were switched to looking, you know, for that sort of UGC material. And at that point, you know, none of us editors appreciated just the extent to which Islamic State, who, you know, many of whom were millennials, had successfully weaponized that part of the internet. And so what these young guys, these young social media monitors was finding, you know, was just the most horrific material possible, and it was having a really damaging effect. And so out of that, and seeing what was happening, the changes in the newsroom, we designed and established a global peer support network that was open to every single journalist, all 2,500 Reuters journalists, whether they were working, you know, stocks, commodities, or UGC monitors, or in the front line. And it was available to them. It was available to their family members. And it's also available to Reuters alumni and freelancers and contractors as well. And that, you know, in itself is extraordinary when you think about it. Our peer network is quite different from other news organizations because we partner with CIC, this company that provides our global sort of trauma hotline and clinical support, in that they select volunteers, journalists. I am a peer supporter myself. We're now a sort of group of 37. We'll be adding to our numbers later this year, and we're established all around the world. So CIC, you know, provides the training and, more crucially, the support, because I'm a journalist. You know, I'm not like Anthony. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a counselor. And it's really important when, you know, a colleague comes to me in a distressed state, and I feel, you know, because of the training that, you know, they need more than just to be able to vent, that they actually need some professional support, that I can hand them over to CIC. And that's really important. And it's important for me too that I, you know, after every call that we take or person that we meet, that we log that with CIC. So there's a trained counsellor at the end of the phone, and then I can talk about that, because, you know, it's really hard to hear, you know, to hear some of the things that we hear and to witness our colleagues' distress. And that's what makes Reuters Peer Network unique, actually, in that we work hand in hand with a group of clinicians. And really, since we established this this global network, it's really paved the way to what we are now seeing as a real cultural shift in newsrooms, and bureaus around the world. I also go out with CIC to some of our frontline bureaus where we hold stress and trauma workshops. And that's really important too, because how, my understanding of stress and trauma, is necessarily quite different from my colleagues in Baghdad or in Nairobi. And that's the challenge for us as a global news organization. There is no one model fits all here. It's important that we find, local sort of solutions actually to these things, especially in many parts of the world where mental health is still terribly stigmatized. So when I was in Iraq a few months ago, people were so concerned about people finding out, actually, that they were struggling because it's seen as a sign of weakness. And so just in talking to them and saying, well, actually, we can organize help with a counselor, in Cairo over Skype, and then no one, need ever know. And that's, just the reaction around the room is like, okay, that's great. So it's really got the conversation going, actually, and that's really important too, because, Will touched upon that. The first thing he said was, I'm not the victim here, those are the victims. And, we journalists are very good, and we have to, actually, in order to do this job, we split off to a degree from our emotions, and we're not very good at giving ourselves permission to be, not okay. And so part of this, cultural shift is actually giving people permission, and that starts from the top. It's very important that the leadership of any news organization backs this. And again, at Reuters, our editor-in-chief, Steve Adler, has really championed this, and that then filters down all the way through the organization. And so, just for example, on the weekend when the Duma chemical attacks, I had a phone call from the night editor. The material coming out was really distressing. And so, again, we remind everyone, these are the sources of support. We talked about it. We have taken sort of concrete measures, actually, just to limit people's exposure to, to this kind of graphic material. And that's huge, actually. And most importantly, we say to people, if you don't want to view this, that's okay. There is no shame in that. And that's a really key message, for everyone, from the newest person, joining the newsroom or the bureau who wants to prove themselves to, people of my age who've been doing this for a long time. And, at times you just think, I've really had enough. And I've said that myself, actually, from time to time, particularly during the sort of beheading period. I just could not stomach watching another beheading. And, I made that clear to people. And that, again, is a really important message for newsrooms and newsroom leaders to make. So more recently, last year, we appointed a full-time, it was a new role, actually, a sort of mental health and well-being sort of strategy head, guy called Dean Yates. Now, Dean Yates was, as a veteran correspondent, he was our Baghdad bureau chief in 2007. At the end of 2016, he wrote a really powerful article about his struggle with PTSD that led to his hospitalization. It's called The Road Toward 17, A Reporter's Battle with PTSD. I would encourage people to read that, actually. Dean went through Bali bombings, the tsunami, but what, at the center of his PTSD was the fact that a couple of our people were killed on his watch in Baghdad. You've probably seen this, the WikiLeaks cockpit video of an Apache, US Apache helicopter, and it killed one of our photographers and our driver. I think it's fair to say that a few years ago, because Dean, was crippled with PTSD and was no longer able to function as a journalist, and he was a really senior journalist. And a few years ago, news organizations would have said, well, okay, you can't work as a journalist and can't really redeploy you, so thank you for your service, goodbye. And we didn't do that. On reading, his powerful account, the head of our HR, another senior manager, they flew out to Australia where he lives, spoke to him about how we could support him and what he could do. And the result is this role. And so Dean, is making a real difference. He's part of, this wider conversation about mental health and how we can best support our colleagues and preserve and build well-being and resilience, because resilience is really key, right? One of the best things he's done, actually, is to establish a blog. And it's great because it's, people are blogging about all kinds of, experiences, whether they are a photographer in Venezuela, having been burned out. I mean, we've even heard from, the wife of someone, who had PTSD, because, of course, it's our families, too, that take an enormous hit. I think, that's an area that we need to start looking at as well, how best we can support families. I realize I'm sort of talking for quite a long time, but we are, it's, the more that we do this and the sort of more conversations that we're having, I mean, now we're looking at harassment of journalists by our sources, actually, and that's a particular problem for a lot of women in many parts of the world. So, we're looking at how we can respond to that harassment online as well. But, it's great. It's just, having got this conversation going, and it's now taking us into all sorts of directions, which is really interesting. And I think I will leave it there.
Thank you. So I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points that Helen made there. So we're seeing a dramatic cultural shift, as I think we've heard in many of the world's leading newsrooms. There is still a long way that needs to go in many other newsrooms. Education is, as you've probably heard, absolutely key. At the back of the report, at the end of the report, we came up with a series of considerations for newsrooms and individuals. And at the heart of that was education. We specifically focused on moral injury, which Anthony said is not a mental illness, but if left unchecked, it can deteriorate into something much more significant. And just also picking up on two other things that both Helen and Will have mentioned. One is this sense of role models. So if you have somebody at a senior level in a newsroom who is prepared to, and it doesn't necessarily need to be management, but somebody who's prepared to put their hand up and say, this is my experience, this brings down taboos, this kind of, this is how I've gone through this journey in a Dean Yates type scenario. Even the work that Will's doing, we're coming forward and talking about it. Another colleague of ours called Yanis Barakis, who is featured in the report as well, has done similar work at Reuters. So it's that sense of, again, giving ourselves permission to say we don't feel great. Let's deal with it. And then just finally going back to what you said about Dean's blog. AFP, for whom Will does a lot of his work, has a blog as well that allows correspondents to talk about their experiences. It's a side of the story that we hear so little. It's really, really important. And I know that, Will, I just want to ask you briefly, I mean, you used that blog as quite a cathartic way to help you deal with your experiences, didn't you? Can you just mention a little bit about that briefly?
Yeah, actually, AFP asked me if I could write a blog after our first meeting together in Paris, because it was pretty new to them that what they heard from me. So they asked me if I could write in their AFP correspondence blog, and I did so. I wrote the entire blog in a plane from Paris back to Athens, and I gotta admit that was the most cathartic process for me. However, having said that, it's not the final edit that I gave. It's by far not the final, because this one was very, very mad. What I wrote is when it also hit me that I'm not okay. How can I be, swearing all the time? I mean, this blog was just swear word after swear word. I was mad at everything. at the Greek authorities, at the European authorities, at the Turkish authorities, at everyone. Why was this thing happening in Greece? But yeah, I wrote that blog, and then edited it and re-edited, and then AFP, I think, did also one final edit before I put it out. It's something that I look back at it and I'm like, okay, this was my life then, and I can understand better what I was going through. Even reading it now, I go back to it and I'm like, okay, Will, so this is what you were feeling.
Would you mind if I just read an extract from the blog now?
No problem.
So we feature the blog in the report, and I just want to read, because to me this is one of the most, every time I read it I'm like, whoa, okay. So it's the first time that I actually see a dead body on the beach. There's no one around, such a small body. I walk around it, I think of my kids. A little further I see a body of an old man. Some colleagues show up. Where are the authorities? We can't just leave them lying on the beach. We go up the road, an undertaker is there and he volunteers to take the bodies. But we can't possibly carry all of these bodies himself. Sorry, he can't possibly carry all these bodies himself. He's one guy with a red van. We reporters end up carrying the bodies to him on the road. I'm devastated. This is a beach on an island in a country that's not at war. This should not be happening. It's sinister. It's evil. Why would this happen? Why would this happen to a small boy? How do you feel hearing that now? How has your journey been in the last couple of years to get to this point?
It's still very difficult to even read it. It is very difficult seeing bodies of young children, especially if you have children. I don't think I'm ever going to get fully over it. And even revisiting these images is always difficult. It's never easy. Yeah.
Thank you for letting us share that, and thank you also for sharing the images. I would say, there's a lot of us here who perhaps don't have the institutional support of big news organisations, but one thing that we can do if we are struggling is write it down. Yep. And that is, something that doesn't cost a lot of money. It may take a lot of time, but certainly I remember, without wanting to go into too much detail, I covered the Haiti earthquake as a journalist, and I spent evenings blogging and swearing and reblogging and ripping up pieces of paper and chucking them in places and rewriting again, and it was incredibly cathartic at the time. And I think we were talking last night at dinner about the fact that perhaps if you're a video journalist and you have a camera, often we give ourselves that sense of, oh, well, it's okay because the camera's the filter, but actually it's not. And sometimes it's the cameramen and the camera women and the camera people and the photographers who perhaps suffer more because they don't write it down. So it's certainly a really good tip. I do just want to stop. There's a couple of questions I have for other panelists, but I want to hear from our colleagues on the floor. If anybody has any specific questions, I would ask that you introduce yourself, please, if you've got any questions. Does anybody have any? Somebody at the back, yeah.
Hi. My name's Frank. I'm a journalism student, and I did a bit of reporting from the Calais jungle, so a very small amount. But my question was, because I definitely came across this, my question was about the impact, Will, you feel that your work's had, and if, as someone who has humanitarian tendencies, if you feel like this is where your best work is being done, and if you feel like journalism has the power to change anything or do anything with this, and the frustrations you've encountered.
Well, definitely, I think journalism has this force to change, and I am happy with my work. I know that I did it my way. Luckily, I'm in an organization as well which did not put me under pressure to produce. They left me on own. They had this vote of confidence, and that is something which is very important from the study as well. That the organization has to trust you because you're the one on the field. Yes, I mean, when you do it your way, it does definitely help you feel good and that you are making a difference. And it's my role as a journalist there is I don't think it was, there's a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of gray for sure. But my role as a journalist was never really blurred. Like, I knew why I was there, the importance of being there, and the importance was to tell the story. Now, it's a different, you know, if you tell the story and you can help, yes, do that, you know? But, yeah.
And I'd just pick up on what Will has said there, just before I come to another question on the floor, is that setting of parameters is so absolutely crucial. Anthony, can you just, you know, we talk about establishing the parameters in your mind in advance of the responsibility and role you're taking on. Can you just talk briefly on that?
I mean, I think that's the heart of moral injury, which is you need to know why you're there and what you need to do as a journalist. And when the margins become blurred, when you start to doubt yourself, when you think you need to step in and do something different and work maybe as a first responder, and you have this moral debate with yourself, that's when you can start getting into difficulties. So I think it's very important that before you do this work, you've got a very clear understanding in your mind why you're there, what are you going to do, what are your priorities. You have to think it through, because otherwise you can make mistakes. And, you know, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, moral injury comes about not just because of what you might do, but also because what you fail to do. And if you end up second-guessing yourself and why did I not do something, that, of course, can be morally injurious as well. So I think, you know, discussions like this are very important because they can help inform your decisions. They can help you decide, how am I going to behave in the field? What am I supposed to do? And if you haven't got any clear ideas about that, you can get into trouble.
I think just a point Will mentioned before about you go to a war zone, you take your physical flak jacket. If you're going to these situations, there has to be an aspect of what I guess I'm calling perhaps a bit naively an emotional flak jacket. So just, I mean, before you go, before Reuters deploys people into these areas, you're having conversations with people about what they might, how important is that?
Yeah, we are now, definitely. Oh, no, that's really crucial. I mean, you know, you can... There are lots of useful things that you can warn people about before they deploy. But just, you know, the fact that you're having an open conversation, you know, in itself is very powerful, because it then immediately establishes a space in which people and the correspondent, the producer, whoever you're sending out, you know, can respond to. That's really important. And also to keep in touch with people when they're away, and then, of course, when they come back. And again, a few weeks after they come back, because it often takes, you know, a while just to process, you know, those aspects of the assignment that you've returned from.
Thank you. Is there a colleague in the...
I'm Jean-Paul Martos. I'm a journalist for Le Soir in Brussels. I'm the former press director of Human Rights Watch, and I've been working with CPJ, and so I'm interested in the impact of that coverage on people and on policies. I mean, and I was just wondering whether you have knowledge of studies trying to understand the impact of those kinds of images on the public, whether it leads the public to feel out of humanity that something has to be done and put pressure on government or on the country. It leads people to just say, don't want to see that anymore. Have you studies about this? I mean, and is there also a psychological impact on the viewers when they see those kinds of strong images that we just saw? Like, as we know, young journalists that are working, watching YouTube videos, for instance, on violence, they're affected by PTSD as well. Are there studies that are on the larger public of those kinds of images? Because it might help journalists to know that if they're impacted themselves personally, when they do this kind of reporting, if they know that there is a positive impact in the sense that something will be done because of their images, it might help them to go through the process of going through the trauma. Whereas if they believe that it has no impact, or on contrary, it might even trigger a reaction against those people saying, I don't want to see it. It might even aggravate the trauma. So have you any idea about this?
You know, it was looked at very closely following 9/11, where there was a tremendous amount of television coverage, of course, and a lot of it was quite traumatic. And there's no doubt that those images affected the general population. what is more difficult to tease out are the long-term effects of that. And the data were quite clear that there are certain vulnerable people. People with a past history of psychiatric difficulties are the ones who are going to be more vulnerable to watching this. So, the answers with these things are never straightforward and simple. That yes, in the short term, people find this distressing. In the long term, probably the majority of people are fine. Those who end up with enduring difficulties from images like this are those who have a vulnerability beforehand, perhaps because of their past psychiatric history, past exposure to trauma, their own emotional baggage that they bring to something. And then, of course, you touch on something else, that when you show this relentlessly over time, you get what's called a compassion fatigue, that people start habituating to it and they just basically turn off. And so many things are going on over here. There isn't a simple answer to a complex question. But in the age of media, when everybody's witnessing things, there's no doubt that this can have an ability to distress people.
I would just add to that, if that's okay. One of the colleagues who we interviewed, because as well as doing the quantitative analysis for the number crunching and the data, we spoke with a few colleagues at length. And one of the colleagues we spoke with at length was a gentleman called Patrick Kingsley, who was at the time the Guardian's migration correspondent. And again, forgive me, indulge me if you don't mind, this is a quote from the interview we did with him because it speaks to this point. There were certain processes and points in the migration crisis where certain key images triggered policy change, certain triggered discussions at a time that the whole conversation was immensely politicised. I mean, I can speak for the UK where I'm based, and it was very, very politically charged in the UK. So he talks about the time when he questioned the value of journalism and what he and others were doing. And he says, so a quote from the report, recalling the image of the dead Syrian toddler Aylan Kurdi, whose body was washed up on a Turkish beach, he writes in his book, and he wrote a book, and if you have the opportunity to read it, it's called The New Odyssey. It's an absolutely fantastic piece of work by Patrick Kingsley. So he writes about how it was one of the very few pieces of journalism to have an individual effect on the public consciousness that summer. And this is a quote. Suddenly everyone cares. Suddenly Europe cares. Aylan's corpse is on the front pages of dozens, if not hundreds of European newspapers the next day, including that of The Sun newspaper, which some of you may be familiar with, whose columnist Katie Hopkins had only a few months before described migrants as cockroaches. Show me bodies floating in the water, Hopkins had written in April, I still don't care. Fast forward to September, and her editors evidently now disagree. In October, they'll be back to their migrant baiting worst, but for a few weeks in the middle, they're forced to change their minds by the brilliance of one Turkish photojournalist. As a specialist, and this is still Patrick's quote, as a specialist who's failed for months to prompt this kind of shift with my own coverage, it is a humbling reminder of my own insignificance. And there you can hear him speaking to the kind of sense of guilt and shame that he felt in the work that he did. Do we have any more questions from colleagues? Do you want to just wait for the microphone, please?
My name is Emmanuel Biro, and I'm a student in journalism. I also used to work in Warzone for the ICRC, International Red Cross. Anyway, I have a question because, okay, you talk about this moral injury. Is there a way for journalists to actually prevent from, or anything that they can do to prevent from feeling this guilt, from feeling this shame? Is there any steps prior that they can take, or not really?
Can I just pause you on that one? We'll take one. There's another gentleman there. We'll take a question from you too, and then, if you don't mind, can you just wait for the microphone, please? Thank you. Thanks.
Hi, I am Adonis Al-Khalid. I come from Damascus, Syria, and since like 2 years I live in Germany, and I joined the bilingual traineeship at Deutsche Welle since 6 months. It's not a question as much as like just a point of discussion. On the journey of refugee, which I took with my brother, I met many journalists in the Greek island, or also in other European countries. And at a certain point, you feel like there are journalists who can understand, like you don't want to be depicted or in this situation, or they respect your wish, and others no, they just continue shooting while you are fragile, or like you don't want to be in this position at this moment. So at this point where if somebody would ask you not to continue recording or like stop at this point, would you do it, or you would just continue and go on with it?
Thank you very much for your intervention, and it sounds like you've got a great new role that you're playing and you're doing. So let's go to Will on your response to that point, and then I think I'll ask Anthony to respond to your point, Emmanuel.
Oh, what I can say about that, first of all, for Lesbos, or any other island where the migrants were arriving, for me as a video journalist, that was the absolutely most difficult thing for me to film, because this is when they were at the most vulnerable, and you're there with a camera in front of your face. That's where a lot of my guilt comes from. I feel guilt, that here I am, and I'm trying to get a sound bite, That is something that it is difficult. As a news agency, and something that we have to report, of course, if anyone says stop, immediately you stop, But even if they don't say, you still feel bad. Now, if you go up to Idomeni, to the camp with the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, there you had all the time in the world to get any sound bites, any images you want. There you fully respect. First of all, you have to build a rapport. I would never start walking with the camera. You talk, you speak, and when you're ready, and everybody knows exactly what you're doing, yes, you film.
Does that answer your question? Yeah? Okay. Thank you. I think Helen wanted to make a point about...
Yeah, I wanted to respond to you as well, because, you're right. The way in which we as a profession ask and approach people at their most vulnerable, varies. Some get it right and are very sensitive, others not so. And actually, I think, one of the challenges for news organizations, and something that we're starting to look at as well, the BBC actually have come up with an amazing course written by one of their reporters who has spent her life as a local reporter, so dealing with, people who've lost their kids to medical blunders, murders, that's the local sort of staple of a local reporter, but it's trauma. So she designed a course which is absolutely brilliant, which she used, in partnership with some of the bereaved people that she's interviewed over the years, about how journalists should approach interviewing traumatized and bereaved people. And it's absolutely fantastic. And that, I think, is something that we should be certainly teaching at the journalism schools, but also incorporating it into our own learning as well when young journalists come to us.
And the Dart Centre as well, if you're not familiar with the Dart Centre, that does work with journalism and trauma and helping support journalists gain skills to interview survivors of trauma. They've got some really good material too. I'm aware that we have probably 5 minutes or so before we need to wrap up, so we'll just go to the point, Anthony, and then I'll ask the panellists to make final comments.
Your question is an excellent one, and we're just starting to understand moral injury in journalists. So I don't think there's a very clear procedure about how to deal with it, other than to come back to the point that education is very important, that people should have an understanding of what it is, how it might arise. And then I think also my personal opinion is that there needs to be, on the part of journalists, a clear understanding of what your role is. What am I going to do? What are the expectations when I'm in the field? What does my newsroom want me to do? And there needs to be a discussion between the journalist and the newsroom about what they should be doing when they confront issues like this. So I think this is, this is the future now. This is one of the big challenges that your profession faces, and how are you going to mitigate against the effects of moral injury? And the final point is this, that guilt, a lot of guilt is misplaced, and you have to be careful of that. It's very easy to feel guilty for the wrong reasons. And when you want to address that, you have to understand where the source of your misplaced guilt is coming from if you're going to deal with it effectively in therapy. So complex issues, but a discussion has now been started, and I think some answers are going to become clearer once you start talking.
Thank you, Anthony. I'll make my final point now, just before thanking the panellists after they've made their point. But it's a difficult time because there are so many different pressures on us as journalists, ranging from economic pressures to issues like online harassment that I deal a lot of work with, so the whole Me Too sexual harassment climate, which has brought up a lot of memories for a lot of people, and also some of the stories we've spoken about today. So it's a difficult time, it's very stressful, but at the same time there's a cultural shift going on where people are feeling more comfortable and more supported in coming forward. So both of those are, I wouldn't totally despair. I just want to move to Helen for your final thoughts, and then we'll hear lastly from Will.
Yeah. I mean, you know, look, let's be honest. We can prepare people as much as we can, in the same way that, you know, now, before we deploy to a war zone, we put people through hostile environment training, and that's, you know, that's good to a point. But, you know, it's only when you're out in the field that you are in a moral maze, and that's not going to change. You know, there's always going to be the unexpected, and that tends to be, the moment or the thing that can upend you very easily. And so, you know, for news organizations and also for journalists, because, you know, journalists have to take primary responsibility for their own mental health, okay? You know, we could have the best sort of program in the world, but if someone doesn't want to access it, or they don't want, you know, they want to keep it all inside, you know, we can't help them. So, you know, it's important that journalists recognize, you know, their responsibilities as well as news organizations, which is quite different, so that when people are upended, that they feel safe enough to reach out either to a peer supporter, to their manager, to to a counselor, that they don't hold it inside. So, you know, it comes back to, you know, education, absolutely. You know, if you understand that you're feeling these awful things, and that's actually quite normal, given what you've just witnessed, that in itself is quite a relief, actually, and it's quite empowering.
Thank you, Helen. And Will?
Exactly what Helen said. I just want to add that, you know, all this education, everything, but also, you know, out there just to, you know, try to do the job that you're feeling comfortable with, you know. And I mean, when I mean comfortable, I mean also in a moral aspect. If you saw in the video, you never saw the face of the person the CPR was given to, and that's because I would never feel comfortable for a mother and somewhere in Syria seeing her son in that state. Never, you know. I'll be able to live with myself. There's always a better way of doing something, a better angle, a better distance, you know. So as long as you feel comfortable with yourself, you know, that's also an antidote, I guess.
Thank you, Will, and I would just thank all of you for dealing with what I think is probably some fairly difficult concepts and some you know, very powerful images and thoughts. So to Will and to Helen and to Anthony, thank you all ever so much for your work, and thanks to the audience.